The wind howled over northern Germany like a wild beast tearing through the bones of an abandoned world. February 1945, one of the last, merciless chapters of World War II, and the countryside was locked in a deadly freeze. It was the kind of cold that seeps beneath your skin, deep into your bones, and threatens to shut down every spark of life. Anyone stranded out here long enough would stand no chance. That was the unspoken truth glaring at every Allied soldier posted along the bitter front. Huddled in a makeshift foxhole, Sergeant James Mcnite stared past the frost caked on his eyelashes, barely able to blink. His uniform, good Canadian issue but never enough, was stiff as armor and his gloved hands already burned with numbness. He glanced at the battered thermometer clipped to his pack, 5 degrees below freezing and dropping. In weather like this, a man could become just another frozen shape in the snow, forgotten by spring. The war was grinding toward its end, but for men like McKnight there was no easing up, no relief, just hours of brutal cold and orders that never bent. McKnight wasn't a city boy hardened by conflict. He was a son of prairie farmland, wide-open Manitoba skis, and wind so fierce it could flatten a man. He'd known cold before, but nothing like this, nothing as pitiless or as lonely. His team, a handful of sharp-eyed men, were dug in here for one very specific reason: watch the road, report enemy movement, don't risk exposure. Most critically, do not get tangled up with the waves of civilians staggering across the war-ravaged landscape. These were not just orders. They were warnings hammered home by commanders again and again, the message clear as ice: this is not our fight. Your soldiers, not saviors. Stay sharp, stay alive, and above all, stay uninvolved. But the world outside their frozen position twisted with uncertainty. The German army was in full retreat, dissolving into thin shadows. Soviet forces swept in from the east with unstoppable fury, shoving thousands, entire villages westward in sheer panic. The result was a human tide of refugees lost in a storm of hunger, exhaustion, and pure terror. Women clutching ragged blankets, children with hollow eyes, elderly men once proud, brought to their knees by war. Every hour, columns of these lost souls crept along icy roads, hopping for mercy, fleeing one horror only to risk another. To the Canadian brass back at base, all of this suffering was just another line in a report. Maintain observation, the orders said. Rescue operations are not your responsibility. In unheated command tents distant from the front, these decisions made sense on paper. But for McKnight and his men, reality was different. Every snapping branch, every sound carried by the wind could be the last cry of someone left behind. The urge to act, human, instinctive, was at war with the iron rules of military discipline. One false step, one moment of misplaced compassion, and his entire unit could be court-martialed or worse, all because he'd chosen to see the suffering that command wanted ignored. For 36 frozen hours, McKnight's crew endured, with no fire, barely any food, and the ghosts of nearby towns swirling just beyond the curtain of snow. They watched, waited, and steeled themselves every time a shadow flickered on the horizon. The only certainty was the cold, gnawing, and relentless. But even in the heart of that icebound misery, something else was starting to break through. Something the war had tried to kill in every soldier, the flicker of humanity that asked, against all logic and order, what if we're the only chance these people have left? But before anyone could answer, the darkness outside shifted, bringing with it a sound no one wanted to hear. A sound that didn't belong to wind or war, a sound that threatened to turn every order upside down. The frozen silence was split by a sound that had no place in war, a sound that drilled down past the ice, past the grind of discipline, straight into the raw nerve of every man on that line. It was faint at first, blurred by the gale, almost easy to dismiss as the winter's cruel imagination. But it came again, echoing off the shattered landscape in a way that couldn't be ignored. McKnight stiffened, all instincts suddenly alive. He listened, holding his breath, letting the world outside the foxhole creep into his senses. Was it the wind, some bizarre echo rolling across the ruins? No, he heard it again, unmistakable this time. Crying, not a whimper or a sob, but the broken wail of children, thin voices stretching through the darkness, sharp with panic, hollowed by desperation. Each note was a razor in his chest, an alarm louder than any gunfire. He glanced at Davies, the Toronto corporal built tough as barbed wire. "Did you hear that?" whispered McKnight, but Davies shook his head, brows pulled tight. "Just the wind, Sarge, gotta be." No one wanted those sounds to be real, because if they were, it meant trouble, the kind of trouble that crawls under a soldier's skin and makes him question who he's supposed to be. But the cries kept coming, separating from the storm, mapping a direction eastward, toward the ruins they'd marched past on patrol just yesterday. That was the dead town, a place gutted by bombs, burned out, the kind of ruin where only shadows lingered. No warmth, no life, certainly no survivors, or so they'd assured themselves before. But now the echoes of the children cut through every comfort of denial. The warnings from command screamed in McKnight's brain, harsh and cold, the official position laid down hours before by officers in heated tents far from the misery on this stretch of road. Do not engage civilians, avoid distractions. They were told the refugee crisis was a German problem, not theirs. The war machine's gears didn't stop for lost kids or broken families. Protect the mission, obey the line. But try telling that to a man from the endless prairies who grew up watching living things freeze in blizzards and understood the exact shade of blue that crept into skin right before life vanished. McKnight was no stranger to hardship, but he'd never seen suffering weaponized quite like this, a silence enforced by fear and regulation. Each cry from the distance was a dare. Do you hear us? Will you answer? He thought about his sister back in Manitoba, bright-eyed and mischievous, bundled against the snow each winter. She'd never known war, never shivered in hunger, never learned terror as a lullaby. That image burned in him, melting a layer of ice even the army's training couldn't shield. The other men in the trench shifted, drawn by the relentless weeping they pretended not to hear. They all understood the risk. Could be a setup, Wilson whispered, radio clutched in his fist. There's been talk Germans using bait, playing dirty, kids as traps. But McKnight's gut told him different. There was nothing tactical in that sound, nothing staged. It was too cracked, too defeated, a kind of hopelessness you can't counterfeit. Inside him, the war of orders versus decency flared. Protocol tried to clamp down on every instinct, but humanity gnawed at the edges. Rules said stay hidden, report, and forget. But reality, starring across a frozen battlefield, was never that simple. I'm checking it out, McKnight said, standing as if the decision had been waiting for him, years in the making. Davies gaped in disbelief, the regulation voice echoing in his tone. Sarge, we step out and we're on our own. You know what that means, you know what they'll call it. McKnight nodded, already moving, boots grinding snow, every soldier's eye burning on his back. What kept each man there wasn't the shout of a superior, but the silent code that runs deeper than orders, a shared oath to never let a comrade face darkness alone. Protocol might have owned their rifles, but their hearts were still human. As McKnight moved, the whole team followed, pulled not by obedience but by something older and much harder to silence. With every step into the swirling white, the crying grew louder, clearer, young voices crying out, an SOS aimed not at generals or governments but at any soul still capable of sympathy. With trembling hands, McKnight scraped frost from his eyes and fixed his gaze on the direction of that haunted plea. They advanced slowly, weapons lowered, senses clutching at every shadow. Each man was gripped by dread of a trap, of the consequences of realizing too late that the real enemy isn't always stationed behind a rifle. Sometimes it hides behind a rule, shrugs inside a regulation, whispers from the mouth of a commander so distant he can't hear the children's cries. And as they reached the battered remains of the schoolhouse where the sound vibrated through crumbled walls, none of them could pretend the cries were just ghosts or echoes. They were real, they were desperate. And the answer to them would shape every life on that battlefield, from the frozen prairie of a Canadian farm to the shattered ruins of war-torn Germany. But nothing, not even the worst-case predictions, could prepare them for what was waiting below the shattered floors in the darkness beneath their boots, a secret so harrowing it would define the rest of their lives. For a split second, the world balanced on a razor's edge. One last gust of wind rattled the bombed-out schoolhouse as McKnight's boot pressed through the shattered doorway. All sense of protocol evaporated. Behind him, the snow smothered every sound except for that desperate crying, no longer distant, now echoing from somewhere below, trembling the air like the heartbeat of a trapped animal. Old bricks stained with soot, jagged glass glittering on icy floors, and those eerie, tiny voices, every detail carved itself into McKnight's mind. There was no tactical advantage down here. No medals, glory, or mention in a general's report. Only a staircase half-slumped leading into a blackness colder than the grave. McKnight moved first, sensing the hesitation in the other man, Davies clutching his rifle, Wilson sending out nervous glances, Patterson's lips pressed tight and pale, Kowalski heavy and silent as a stone pillar. But they all followed, boots clanking softly as they descended, every sense on red alert. The basement hit them with a slap of dead air, a chill that clawed deeper than any winter. It was the reek of old fear mingled with the metallic scent of frozen blood and scorched earth. Flashlights swept the corners. At first they saw only rubble and shadows, but then clustered together in one trembling mass were the children. 18, huddled like a litter of pups, arms entwined over bony shoulders, eyes too large for their sunken faces. Oldest no more than 12, the youngest barely out of toddlerhood. Blue-tinged lips, skin gone gray. Some shivered violently, others, lost in shock, stared at McKnight's crew with haunted faces so empty they barely seemed alive. There's no training manual for a sight like that. The hard men of the front went silent, breath fogging in the beams of their lanterns, moments stretched heavy with dread. These were enemy children, German kids, the sons and daughters of a nation the Allies had spent years battling in mud, blood, and fire. The official word from command was crystal clear: do not get involved. This was not their responsibility. These kids were supposed to be statistics, faceless casualties, their pain filed under civilian collateral. But the wall of professionalism crumbled as reality hit. The children flinched not just from cold but from terror. When the soldiers drew near, some began to cry out in German, their voices sharp with panic, pleading for mercy, mistaking the men's approach for the arrival of death, not rescue. For one heart-stopping moment, nobody moved. McKnight saw his reflection in their terror. All his life he'd been haunted by the cries of helpless animals when the prairie winters hit. But this was different. These were children red-cheeked and howling months ago, now reduced to hollow shells wrapped in scraps of cloth. A little blonde girl curled tighter, trembling so hard her teeth chattered like dice in a cup. That cry, raw, unmistakable, broke the stalemate. McKnight bowed his head, the burden of decision heavy as a gravestone. Rules and consequences flashed through his mind, each one colder than the next. Disobey orders, risk court-martial, jeopardize the mission and the safety of the whole crew. But none of it mattered in this moment. His conscience, forged in Canadian snows and seasoned by the cruelties of war, rose up. Right here, right now. Humanity first, officers' orders BD end. He didn't bark commands, he simply spoke, voice thick with certainty. We're taking them, all of them. The words landed like a grenade. Davies stared at him incredulously. Sarge, our truck barely hauls us, never mind an army of kids. Wilson shook his head in disbelief. Patterson whispered, are you sure? Kowalski, a man of few words, just leaned forward, lifting the smallest child into his massive arms without waiting for permission. Logic said it was madness. 18 starving, half-frozen children, most unable to walk, 2 or 3 already unresponsive, skin glassy with premortem stillness. Their bodies so frail, their fate so close to the edge, McKnight knew they wouldn't even last another hour in that sub-zero crypt. The cost of hesitation was death. If they tried to pull rank, call for clearance, wait for a higher-up, those kids would become nothing more than statistics, another heartbreak hidden in the footnotes of the war. He moved quickly, gently touching each child, checking for signs of life. 2 in the far corner didn't react at all, hypothermia already stealing their breath. For McKnight, there was no time to weigh rules. Orders from a distant war base could not blot out the truth inside these walls. As soldiers, they still had a duty to the innocent, even those behind enemy lines. He turned to his team, eyes fierce with new resolve. Start getting them up, carefully, no sudden movements. The men didn't need another word. They became a lifeline tethered by hope, each pair of rough hands carrying bodies light as feathers but heavy with fate. Patterson and Davies lifted older boys frail as scarecrows. Kowalski cradled 3 children together, silent in his soft strength. Wilson supported a girl too weak to stand, skin paper-thin over fragile bones. McKnight himself scooped the most critical, 2 limp bodies, one under each arm, praying the warmth of his grip could spark life. His thoughts flashed to a distant farmhouse, his mother's gentle voice, the warmth of Canada's family kitchen. Today, kindness was a weapon more valuable than any rifle in his arsenal. The struggle wasn't over. Above, the mission only grew more impossible. The math was a nightmare: 5 soldiers, 18 kids, 1 battered truck, but the dying could no longer be left behind. Orders BD end. This was the kind of line that divides men from machines, compassion from cold bureaucracy. As the first snowflakes dusted their boots on the ruined street, McKnight knew one thing for certain. The war had given him choices, but in this frozen ruin, only one choice truly mattered. The scramble outside felt like a battle, one with no gunfire, only the ticking clock of advancing frost and collapsing bodies. Above the ruined basement, the night didn't care about courage or compassion. The ice stung harder now, and the sky pressed down with its endless glacial weight. Survival was suddenly a feat of raw problem-solving under fire. McKnight dragged both hypothermic kids clear of the schoolhouse, desperate to hold onto whatever faint pulse he could feel beneath their icy skin. Around him, the team hustled, shoulders hunched, faces set in stone. These soldiers weren't just breaking the rules, they were crushing them beneath their boots, swept forward by conscience and adrenaline. Nobody shouted, nobody complained. Each man was wrapped in the tension of impossible logistics. Their truck loomed out of the blizzard like salvation and a curse. Old army steel, battered but running, its bed never designed for such a payload. The math was brutal and unyielding. 18 barely living children, 5 grown men, and a shell of a machine meant for a handful of supplies, not an emergency rescue. McKnight's first order was sharp: dump anything that isn't vital. Within seconds, the operation became a frantic race against time. Ammunition boxes clattered onto the snow. Tool kits, extra rations, fuel cans they'd hoarded in case of retreat, all jettisoned. Only the radio, medkit, and essential weapons stayed. Space mattered more than firepower now. The men ripped out every barrier they could, then ripped up the standard army plan. Someone, Wilson, maybe, or Davies, grabbed the canvas benches running along the truck's bed, sliding them aside to create a bare, cold floor. Instead of standing on protocol, they stood on desperation. The first children went in gently. The youngest, shivering and silent, were placed nearest the cab where the engine might radiate a fragment of warmth through the metal. The older kids filled the center, wedged shoulder to shoulder in a haphazard tangle of limbs and worry. There was no way to keep order. There was only in and alive or out and gone forever into the snow. McKnight thought in rapid-fire pulses, keep the real sick ones by the engine wall, rotate them every 15 minutes. It was triage, not regulation, and every movement mattered. He pressed his warmest gloves against the blue fingers of a boy hopping to bully heat back into his veins by sheer force of will. Packing the soldiers in with their cargo, the math bent but didn't break. Davies and Patterson squeezed onto the edge. Legs pressed tight against ribs so slight they barely felt like children. Wilson wound himself around a tangle of tiny legs and arms, eyes never leaving the half-frozen girl in his lap. Kowalski, the strongest of them, pulled a pair of children close with silent steadiness. They barely left themselves space to breathe. But they all fit barely. The impossible became possible, not through planning but through the refusal to let fear and rules win. With everyone secure and the precious radio still hooked up, McKnight grabbed the battered handset and delivered a message he knew could end his career. Recon 4 to base, classified humanitarian. We are moving 18 enemy civilian miners, severe medical, requesting clearance for medevac west. The radio's reply was ice cold and slow. Protocol trumped compassion. Negative, maintain observation, do not transport civilians. Contact German authorities. There were no German authorities, the war had wiped them off the map. Sir, these kids will die on the road, we can't wait. Silence crackled. Then quiet, weary, and thinly veiled came permission. Risk the route, do it alone. If the squad ran into trouble, command wouldn't come to help. So, against the odds, against all orders, they moved out, McKnight taking the wheel, every nerve blistering with the weight of what came next. The journey was an odyssey through a world that had forgotten mercy. 4 hours on snow-choked roads, through bombed villages and past huddled refugees, every mile inviting disaster. The heater in the cab coughed and groaned, never touching the back. McKnight ordered the rotation of bodies, warm those at the edge, trade places every 15 minutes, keep circulation moving. Starvation and cold gnawed at everyone, but even the smallest acts helped. Patterson broke his last chocolate bar into microscopic pieces, melting them on his palm for lips too numb to chew. Water rationed in trembling sips. No one complained. Twice the truck rolled through abandoned towns, husks of stone with no life except the haunted eyes of old men watching from doorways. The third village nearly spelled the end. Down the central street, German soldiers, teenagers in battered uniforms, stepped out, guns in hand, faces carved by fear and rage. McKnight saw it, the line where survival turns to violence. He motioned, weapons down, eyes forward. Then unexpectedly, one of the older German girls rose in the truck, barely able to stand, and called out in her own language. Kinder, the single word sliced through the standoff. In that instant the enemy soldiers blinked, looking past uniforms and rifles to see what the truck carried, children, not prisoners. The hand that blocked their path dropped. The way opened. McKnight's truck lurched past, the world saved by a child's cry. Each breath was agony, each bump in the ice a fresh test. But after 4 hours inside that rolling miracle of chaos, the Allied medical station finally came into view. Relief swept the crew, so staggering that McKnight nearly overshot the entrance. Doctors ran out, nurses flinging open truck doors. The rescuers handed over their charges, every last one. Medics, jaws tight with awe and urgency, pulled the half-frozen bodies from the truck. Healing blankets, steaming water, resources reserved for the rarest of emergencies. For one heartbeat, McKnight's eyes blurred, frost, exhaustion, or something deeper. The knowledge that, at least for tonight, the impossible was just something they were told couldn't be done. The battle for survival didn't end at the steps of the field hospital. It only shifted, becoming a fight against invisible enemies: frostbite, hypothermia, exhaustion, and the psychological chaos that always lingers after impossible choices. As the battered truck rocked to a stop in the snow-drifted clearing, the world seemed to slow for just a moment. Then, everything happened at once. Doctors and nurses poured out of the largest tent, faces made hard by months on the front lines but still shocked by the sight before them. 18 half-frozen German children, eyes sunken, skin like wax, stacked arm to arm atop and among rough American winter uniforms. Behind them, 5 soldiers barely less battered, running on courage and willpower now stretched to a breaking point. This wasn't in any training manual, not even for the most hardened medical staff working under the stars and stripes. Urgency replaced ceremony. Medics grabbed stretchers and began triage on the icy ground. Hypothermia, severity critical. We need warm fluids now. Get the little ones on heating pads stat. Every doctor's voice was sharp, urgent, drowning out even the rumble of backup generators. The rules of engagement were gone. This was pure humanitarian combat. Orders blurred to nothing in the face of dying children. The most fragile, those Mcnite had carried himself, were whisked straight to the surgical tent. The girl, her core temperature plummeted to where most would have slipped away quietly, now fought for each shallow breath under layers of emergency blankets. The boy beside her was even worse, so far gone the doctors worried his heart would give out before dawn, but the staff didn't quit. American medics had a reputation in Europe, relentless even when the odds are bad. Here, doctrine and discipline took a back seat to basic decency. Inside the main medical tent, the scene was dizzying. Blankets hissed in the steam of portable heaters, the scent of hot broth and disinfectant filled the air. Nurses moved with the efficiency of a unit on high alert, wrapping limbs, checking vitals, smoothing hair off damp foreheads. One nurse, her accent pure New York, pressed a hand to McKnight's shoulder. "Sergeant, I need detail, names, history." But all he could say was, "We found them in a basement. No names, no English, just kids." She nodded and vanished back into the whirlwind, calling for a translator, her own empathy a silent bridge. Time lost all meaning. For the next 2 hours, the soldiers stood in limbo, breath plumbing in the darkness outside the tents, while inside, doctors and nurses waged war against the cold's silent destruction. Occasionally, the rescue team would spot a glimpse through the open flap, a shivering child bundled in foil, a medic whispering encouragement in stilted German, an IV line taped to a pencil-thin arm. Each scene pressed deeper into memory than any firefight. Finally, the numbers returned. All 18 children survived the night. The miracle cost them pieces of themselves. A girl lost the tip of her finger, a boy several toes, but the army's intervention had swatted death away. The girl with the worst hypothermia made the slow climb back. The boy nearly gone was less lucky. The doctors saved him but declared his left hand and right foot forever altered by war's cruelest currency, frostbite. For McKnight and his team, it was a victory measured not in territory or enemy casualties, but in the number of breaths drawn by children who wouldn't have survived another hour in no man's land. But wartime miracles always come with a price, sometimes paid in headlines, sometimes in silence. No handshake from command, no congratulations. Instead, the military police arrived with the cold professionalism of a frontline patrol. "Sergeant McKnight, you and your men will report for inquiry immediately." The word stung worse than the wind, colder than the snow they'd just braved. The rescue might have made them heroes in the eyes of medics and children, but regulation didn't bend for heroics. The rules were stone, and they'd shattered them for the sake of a dozen and a half German kids. Inside the temporary field headquarters, a long, chill tent lined with folding tables and the United States flag, 3 senior officers sat in judgment. None smiled. The colonel's words left no doubt about the mood. "You abandoned post without authorization. You carried out an unauthorized mission through enemy territory. You put not only your men but American and Allied strategy at risk. Do you understand the seriousness of this?" McKnight, still raw from adrenaline, still feeling the aftershocks of seeing life and death so close together, answered simply, "Yes, sir, I know what I did. I'd do it again." Each crew member, questioned alone, repeated the truth. "We made the call together. We knew the risk. We made a choice." But bureaucracy is relentless. The officers cataloged every infraction. When you take the lead, your men will follow even into danger the mission did not require. You abused that trust. Yet behind every stern glare there was something else, a glimmer in the captain's eye as he asked, "What did you see down there, Sergeant?" McKnight's reply was all that mattered. "I saw children, only children, dying and afraid. I saw what war forgets." For a single breath, the cold in the tent wasn't quite so harsh. No U.S. base regulation could erase the reality that sometimes just seeing humanity is its own act of heroism. The inquiry ended not with gavel strikes but with a shadow of uncertainty. McKnight and his crew were confined to base, waiting for judgment. Punishment was possible, maybe even likely. No promise of medals, no guarantee their names would ever escape the incident report log. Outside, though, the field hospital hummed with a different story. Children laughed, a sound so rare after sunset, it froze passing soldiers in their tracks, made even the toughest combat medics pause and smile. In the end, American war bases have always been built not only on firepower and tactics, but also on those fleeting moments when humanity rises above the orders and the odds. And as the first light dawned over a battered, slowly healing camp, you could almost believe the impossible had happened. That the harshest winter had given up some of its grip, if only for a single, unforgettable night. The glare from the command tent's fluorescent lights was almost as harsh as the Arctic wind outside. Inside the temporary U.S. base, military discipline kept everything tight: the rows of cots, the steel-gray order of daily logs, the clipped footsteps of military police as they escorted McKnight and his crew into the inquiry room. Here, the stakes felt higher than any firefight. No roar of artillery to drown the judgment. Just the brittle sound of pencils scratching down each word, recording every violation for history to audit. For 3 endless weeks, McKnight and his men existed in a kind of quarantine. They were still soldiers, still part of the machine, but now under the microscope: no more patrols, no more freedom to disappear into the gray. Every meal, every movement, every day spent waiting for a decision that could define the rest of their lives. The war still raged just miles away, but now the front line was a desk, a stack of witness statements, and regulations so thick they could smother even the brightest act of conscience. Each man faced the tribunal separately. The colonel always opened the same: "Sergeant, do you understand the gravity of your actions? Leaving post, transporting enemy civilians, placing your crew, yourself, and mission risk on the line for unauthorized activity. These are serious breaches. In wartime, the order is survival, not sentiment." And each time, McKnight answered the same: "Yes, sir." He didn't offer excuses, didn't justify. In the frozen silence of those hearings, the rules seemed as permanent and immovable as the stone foundations of any American base built to last beyond war or weather. The price for saving 18 children was, at least for now, an official stain on their records. No medals, no press releases, just the tension lingering invisible. Their crew was confined to base, unable to join the endgame as Allied advances tightened the noose on a fractured enemy. For men built to endure, the waiting was almost another kind of frostbite, a slow, biting ache that refused to fade. Meanwhile, outside the command tents, a different conversation had begun. Word of the rescue flowed through the medical field and into the Allied camp like warm air slipping under a door. A nurse wrote home, her letter intercepted by a journalist. A U.S. Army doctor filed an unusual report, noting the outstanding ethical bravery of a Canadian squad. Rumors snowballed, pushing past censors, crossing borders and oceans, until the story traveled faster than official paperwork could smother it. By the end of the week, headlines flickered across Europe and America. American and Allied soldiers defy orders to save German children. Kindness in the shadow of war. The military brass, always wary of bad press, was suddenly caught between two fronts: condemn their men for insubordination and look heartless to the world, or quietly swallow the breach and let history judge the rest. But for every story of courage, there were dozens whispered beneath the surface, accounts never written up, tragedies never told. In the same region during the same frigid week, orders had been obeyed to the letter. Soldiers encountered refugees, radioed for proper authorities, and waited for a bureaucracy that never made it in time. The result: abandoned children, entire families frozen in abandoned homes, nameless bodies unearthed by spring thaws. Estimates were ugly: 200 civilians dead that week, Frost's invisible tally, all because orders kept armies at arm's length. For McKnight and his men, learning those numbers was a bitter, hollow victory. They'd saved 18, but how many more vanished in silence, swallowed by protocol? Each piece of news hit like an aftershock, a grim reminder that the coldest casualties of all are often invisible. The cost of doing nothing, of following rules so blindly you stop seeing the humans right in front of you. But within the base's boundaries, hope still flickered. Day by day, the children grew stronger. Medical staff and translators pieced together their stories: how parents had hidden them as firebombs fell, how each child had clung to hope in the frozen dark, waiting for any sign of rescue, never knowing if enemy or friend would appear first. Some kids would never see their families again. Others would be found, reunited by Red Cross efforts powered by the same Allied network that had once only tracked troop movements and supply lines. Every evening, McKnight's crew gathered at the edge of the barracks, the only place rules allowed them to taste open air. They didn't speak much about their ordeal, but the knowledge hung between them. They survived the judgment of war, but now faced the judgment of their own command. There aren't medals for this kind of aftermath. But there's a kind of pride, ancient and elemental, the kind that's kept men alive on every U.S. war base from Normandy to Kabul, knowing you did what was right even if nobody ever said so. As days passed, the question echoed: would the army punish them? Would they become a cautionary tale buried in training manuals, or would someone somewhere admit that sometimes the only way to serve is to break the rules built by men who never saw a child shivering in a bombed-out ruin? It was a tension that stretched on weeks of anticipation, rumor, and the quiet, almost guilty satisfaction of seeing children finally smile in the tent city behind the wire. For McKnight, the answer was simple. Even if the base stripped his stripes, even if they rewrote the story with black ink on paper, what mattered wasn't the command structure. It was the lives still breathing, the stories not cut short, the proof that sometimes, just sometimes, good men at war choose to be more than perfect soldiers. They choose to be imperfect and human, and ultimately that's what shapes the memory of every base, every squad, every generation that follows. Heroism on the battlefield often fades before the last echo of a gunshot, overshadowed by the next day's orders or the churn of endless supply convoys rolling out from base. But sometimes, the ripples from a single act grow wider, pulling lives and even entire institutions into their current, making small miracles matter longer than anyone ever expects. Inside the perimeter of the U.S. war base, the weeks following the rescue drew on with a peculiar hush. The official inquiry dragged forward, the paperwork as cold as the wind that still roared outside every tent flap. But on the far side of the snow-drifted camp, where the medical stations buzzed night and day, another story was being written, one not captured by after-action reports or cold policy memos. This story lived in the eyes of the children, in their slow, miraculous recovery, in the language barriers that were gradually broken down, not just with translators but with toys, songs, and the universal kindness of a soldier's outstretched hand. It took days for the outside world to hear what had happened, but once the tale escaped the wire, it moved with volatile energy. From the American Field Hospital, a letter home by a nurse made its way to a newspaper editor in New York. Soon, a ripple of headlines began popping up at bases across the East Coast. Canadian Sergeant SAVES Enemy Children, Compassion DEFIES Cold War Orders. Would you break military protocol to save a life? 18 lives saved in frozen hell, what would you have done? Officers across U.S. commands took notice. The questions trickled into mess halls and staff briefings. Who gets to decide what's right when the bullets have stopped but the suffering hasn't? Journalists, never satisfied by official statements, tracked down medics, translators, even a few lucky soldiers who had witnessed the children being carried off the truck. Slowly, painful as it was, the world learned the difference between rules and values, between the machinery of war and the enduring pulse of human decency. Weeks later, the bureaucracy relented. With the world watching and the rescue story still circling, the inquiry was quietly closed. No conviction, no demotion. Not even a slap on the wrist. If the base command was reluctant to pin a medal on McKnight's chest, they were even more afraid of the headlines that would bloom if they called him a criminal for saving kids. In the long shadow of war, sometimes doing the right thing becomes the only thing people remember. But while the military's official position was silence, the story's true echo lived on in quieter ways, carried in letters home, whispered in the halls of American bases overseas, debated late into the night by young officers faced with their own "what would you have done" moments. It's a story that worked its way into the unofficial curriculum of every training camp, a use case in the most advanced American war colleges, and a topic for chaplains ministering to troops searching for purpose after the shooting stops. For McKnight and his men, the war itself soon ended. The spring thaw brought the first tremors of peace, and base life began to shift toward homecoming. Some of the rescued children were tracked down by aid workers, their families notified by telegram and word of mouth across a shattered continent. Others, orphaned by war, started new lives under the watchful care of Allied agencies. An entire generation's fate changed by a handful of rules broken on one night far from home. Then came the true test of memory. Years on, as military bases across the world moved on from the war, the story continued to reach new ears in military ethics classes, leadership briefings, and articles tucked into newsletters for American veterans. The question haunted every generation that heard it: when the rules say no, but your conscience screams yes, what will you do? 15 years later, the next ripple arrived. For Sergeant McKnight, now back home in the fields of Manitoba, it was just another quiet day until a letter appeared from Germany. The return address, handwritten and shaky, transported him back to that frozen basement, to the faces he could never quite forget. Inside was a photo. 5 grown adults, healthy and alive, their faces familiar no matter how much age had softened them. The enclosed note, laboriously written in English, was signed by 5 of the rescued children. They had found each other. They remembered who had given them back their lives. 6 months later, those 5 survivors, no longer children, now with families and careers, crossed an ocean to visit McKnight's family farm. The reunion, awkward at first and then almost joyfully tearful, brought together not just old soldier and saved lives, but the surviving members of his old war crew, Davies, Wilson, Patterson, a gathering bound by something deeper than orders, something that had survived the passage of time, bureaucracy, and even language itself. Stories were shared in the gentle comfort of peacetime, their childhoods lost but their hope restored, memories of their parents hunting for food, of the moment they realized the men in strange uniforms were not there to hurt but to save. The girl who nearly lost her hands displayed her fingers with pride, living proof that the warmth of a human decision can sometimes save not just a life but a future. The boy who would always walk with a limp became a teacher, telling his own students about the soldiers who chose kindness over caution. The bond was no longer German or Canadian, not even Allied. It was, in many ways, the most American of all, proof that people from different places caught in the planet's darkest storms can still see the spark of humanity in one another. They left a gift for McKnight, a wooden plaque carved with the names of all 18 children from that night. That plaque would hang for decades, first on McKnight's own wall and then in the U.S. Military History Museum, a relic not just of protocol broken but of bridges built across oceans and decades. The ripples traveled even further. The rescue at the snowy edge of a U.S. base became part of the official case files when years later the Geneva Conventions were revised, to clarify, because of cases just like this, that soldiers are obliged not just to follow orders, but to honor the core values of compassion and courage, even when those values put them at odds with authority. Today, that story is told not only in war colleges across America, but also in ethics classrooms, chaplain training, and the grief groups that help returning soldiers put a name to the feelings that can't always be squared with the chain of command. The legacy of that night, born in ice and risk and impossible odds, still ripples across time and continents. It calls up that most American of military questions: when the world gives you rules, do you have the courage to be remembered for something more? War has a way of asking questions that never really fade. Even after the debriefs are filed, the ribbons are boxed, and the barracks fall quiet beneath another country's sky. Decades after the firefights, commanders still gather the next generation of recruits and ask them the hardest questions. What will you do when orders say hold your ground but your heart says act? Who are you when the stripes on your shoulder and the medals on your chest suddenly weigh less than the cry of a desperate child echoing down a ruined street? On every U.S. military base, from the sand-blasted lines of the Middle East to the snow-swept training fields in Alaska, McKnight's choice has become more than just another story from the past. It's a mirror held up to every soldier, every leader, every civilian trying to walk the line between duty and conscience. It's a lesson woven right into basic training and endlessly debated in the war colleges at West Point and Annapolis. In leadership seminars, instructors ask their class, is your first obligation to the chain of command or to the deepest values you carry from home? When the rules are tested by real suffering, which side will you stand on? When veterans gather on bases for Memorial Day barbecues or sit in the long chill of mess halls sharing coffee at midnight, stories like this surface, warming the frozen places in a soldier's memory. The plaque with those 18 names, once hung in McKnight's farmstead, now rests behind glass on a U.S. military museum wall, a silent question confronting every new class of officers. What does it mean to be a hero? Who decides when it's time to break the mold? The military, for all its structure and doctrine, isn't just built on tactics and discipline. It is built on character, on those old echoes of home: compassion, honesty, sacrifice, the very things that set the foundation for every fort, every base, and every outpost America has ever built. In those values drilled into cadets and reinforced in chaplains' sermons, the story of one cold night in 1945 becomes more than just history. It becomes compass and caution. McKnight's story lives in leadership manuals as the impossible choice scenario. Do you obey protocol or do you trust your gut when a life hangs in the balance? What risk are you willing to shoulder so that someone else, child, stranger, even enemy, gets one more chance to live? In lectures on war law and the ethics of command, cadets are reminded how close the line between duty and decency can truly be. Officers in training ask, what would have become of those 18 children if the rules had held? The silence that follows is often heavier than any written examination. The world is full of people who salute, say the right words, and let the machinery keep rolling. But history only remembers those who, in the smallest moments of decision, dare to let their conscience outshine their fear. On every U.S. base, there's a pride in that legacy, a pride not just in victories won but in lives saved, values defended, and humanity preserved in the very heart of conflict. Sometimes the most powerful legacy left by a soldier is not the number of battles fought or campaigns survived, but the answer to a simple question passed down at campfires, in after-action reports, in the whispered stories of survivors. What kind of person do you want to be when all the ranks, all the rules, and all the noise fall away? Even the sharpest soldiers aren't immune to doubt. Years later, McKnight's crew gathered around his table. Davies, the corporal once hardened by rules, admitted he still had dreams of that night, both terror and hope flickering in the cold. Wilson, the radio man, kept a letter from one of the rescued children folded in his wallet, as a reminder that sometimes one act, one break from routine can ripple out for generations. Patterson, the youngest, built an entire life around the lesson of that rescue, teaching his own children that rules matter, but only if they serve something larger than themselves. For soldiers returning from war, the story offers a rare kind of absolution, the chance to believe that even amidst the worst destruction, decency and courage can outlast the guns. For new recruits at any U.S. base, the lesson is clear. The kind of person you want to be is decided in 1,000 small, silent moments when nobody is watching, and especially when the world is. Today, when someone walks into a lecture hall at a war college, whether it's at West Point or a forward operating base in Korea, they'll see the story of McKnight, illustrated with faded photographs, battered equipment, and that wooden plaque. They'll walk back to their barracks, hearts heavier, thoughts spinning with what-ifs. And across those sprawling fields of American training grounds, from bunkroom to command center, a single unspoken challenge echoes on. Rules may win battles, but only values win history. That is the legacy no winter can silence, no regulation can erase, the legacy of choosing on America's hardest nights to be more than a soldier, to be human and to leave the world a brighter place because of it.